Hello and welcome back to Missouri DMH's Deaf Services Training. This is Unit 3, and in this unit we're going to be discussing hearing loss in general, different types of hearing loss, certain technologies that are available to aid with hearing loss, and we're going to spend a little bit of time discussing certain factors, developmental factors that are important to know when working with deaf and hard of hearing individuals. The first thing I really want to point out as we start getting into hearing loss is to understand that hearing loss occurs on a spectrum. It's not a matter of everyone who's deaf is deaf and everyone who hears can hear. There's a broad range of deafness, hard of hearing, and hearing. It's also very important to point out that we use the term hard of hearing and deaf when we describe hearing loss. Over the years, we've heard several different terms. Hearing impaired is very common. I've even heard deaf and dumb, deaf and mute. Terms like those generally are not accepted in deaf and hard of hearing cultures, and we prefer the term hard of hearing. The problem with using terms such as hearing impaired, deaf and dumb, deaf and mute, is those tend to imply a deficit. Those tend to imply that there's something wrong or there's something missing with that individual, rather than using a more politically correct term such as hard of hearing. So there's a broad range of hearing loss. Being hard of hearing does not mean just one thing. It could mean any number of things, and we'll discuss that a little more as we move through this video session. Some important things, medical considerations when we're talking about hearing loss. The etiology of the hearing loss is very important. Definitely in a mental health setting, you want to find out what that etiology is, meaning how did the hearing loss occur, when did it occur. There are certain medical conditions that cause hearing loss that can also cause other medical issues. An example of this would be Usher syndrome, which is fairly common in causing hearing loss and causing deafness, but also causes visual impairments. There's something called long QT syndrome as well that causes hearing loss. It also causes sudden genetic cardiac problems. So understanding the medical reasons behind the hearing loss and the etiology is vital whenever you're working with deaf and hard of hearing individuals. Oftentimes we find that the individual themselves may not know what the etiology is, although it is important to try to find that out. And we find that that's partly due to the lack of communication with families, lack of communication with doctors. A lot of times they just don't find out why and where and when and how the hearing loss occurred. We also find individuals with hearing loss that may know the reason, but that reason may be untrue. I've heard several different versions of how my hearing loss came to be, from any number of diseases and fevers and things occurring in childbirth to my parents were sinful and therefore I have hearing loss. So because they may have an answer for you does not always mean it's true, and there may need to be some more investigation and some more digging to find out the actual reason for the hearing loss. It's also important to find this out again because of the other medical problems that may occur and any other medical issues that may pop up in the course of you working with that deaf and hard of hearing individual. Another medical consideration when we're discussing hearing loss is the frequency of other medical issues, as I just said, and other disabilities is high. And we're actually seeing this number increasing as medical technology develops, as prenatal care develops, medications, vaccines. We're starting to see this co-occurring medical issues and disabilities number start to run very high. Another medical consideration is vision problems. Obviously, what we've learned so far in Unit 1 and Unit 2 of these video series, deaf and hard of hearing folks tend to rely very heavily on vision, especially those that use any kind of manual signed language. Vision is key, but we do often see vision problems being a part of those medical issues that cause the hearing loss. So vision problems happen. It's important to know. It's important to be able to compensate and assist that individual with any vision problems and how that may affect communication. So now that we've discussed medical considerations, I want to talk a little bit about functional considerations. I want you to start to think about hearing in terms of functional categories. So when we discuss these functional categories, there are three. The first and most basic is an awareness of sound. Is that individual aware of sound occurring around them? Are they able to tell that noises are being made? That's the first level of functional categories. The second is the identification of that sound. So now this individual is aware that there's sound occurring around them. Are they able to identify what that sound is? Is that a door slamming? Is that a doorbell? Is that somebody knocking at the door? What is the sound that they're perceiving? The third and more complex level of functioning when we talk about hearing loss is comprehending human speech. So they're aware of sound. They're able to identify what that sound is. If they're able to identify that that's human speech, are they then able to discern and comprehend what that human speech is? One example of these functional levels, a personal example, is myself. So as I explained in Unit 1, I come from a deaf of deaf family. Everyone in my family is deaf, parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents. In my family, you're either born completely or what we call profoundly deaf, or you're born hard of hearing with a degenerative hearing loss, meaning it gets worse through the years, and what we call severe word discrimination. What that means is, in terms of these functional categories, is I'm able to be aware of sound, I'm able to identify what that sound is, but when we get to that more complex level of comprehending human speech, I have difficulty with that. Particularly if there's other background noise, I have a hard time discerning what is being said, what words are being used. Certain words sound like other words to me, and so on and so forth. So that gives you an idea of how these different levels may work. When taking a look at these functional categories, especially with human speech, it's important to look at how this might change with or without technology. Does hearing aids help them to advance to other levels? Does a cochlear implant help them advance to other levels? Does it impede their advancement to other levels? It's also important to look at these in terms of the optimal conditions. In a one-on-one setting, face-to-face, good lighting, quiet environmental noise, things like this, what level of functional category are they able to achieve? Another thing I would like to point out here is that somebody's speech skills does not necessarily equal their hearing skills. Their hearing skills does not necessarily equal their speech. Now, what I mean by this is somebody could have excellent speech and poor hearing, or vice versa. Somebody could have excellent hearing or poor speech. Again, look at this on a spectrum, look at this on a continuum, that there is a whole variance of levels of speech and hearing, and they're not always connected. It's easy to sometimes assume that because somebody can hear well, they will then be able to speak well, or because somebody can speak well, they will then be able to hear well. In my time as a counselor, I saw a broad range of individuals, from folks that had their hearing loss later on in life, and so their speech was excellent. They could speak clearer than most people I know, however, they couldn't hear anything. And as clinicians or as mental health professionals working with that individual, it's easy to hear them speak well and mistakenly assume that they can hear you well, or vice versa, to know that they're hearing you well and to mistakenly assume that they can speak well. I want to take a few minutes and let's talk about technology that aids with hearing loss. The two main technologies that are available are hearing aids and cochlear implants. I'm not going to get real in depth with how these work, but I do want to give you kind of an overview of how each of them differ and what their intended purpose is. So when we talk about hearing aids, and I have pictures for you here, this first slide of pictures of hearing aids I put in here just to have a little bit of levity. These are not, I'm sure you know, hearing aids that are used today. However, these are hearing aids that were used in the past. I actually have a family member that enjoys collecting the massive variety of hearing tools that have been used over the time. I think definitely my favorite on this one is in the bottom right-hand corner, where the guy is strapped to a massive machine. This next slide, these are what actual hearing aids look like today. There are a variety of them. A good chunk of them go over the ear, as you can see in the picture in the right. There is a soft plastic piece that goes into the ear, and then it's held in place with the mechanics that go around the ear. They're battery operated. What hearing aids do is basically elevate any kind of sound that's around them. So if there's environmental noises, if there's people talking in the room, if you're in a loud meeting and people are coughing and sneezing, it's going to pick up and amplify any sound that is being made. Now, if you think about this in terms of the functional considerations we just talked about a moment ago, this may be helpful for level 1 being awareness of sound. Level 2, it may help with identification of sound. And level 3, for certain individuals, it may help with discerning or comprehending human speech. For someone like myself who has that severe word discrimination and background noise makes it more difficult to comprehend human speech, obviously hearing aid is not going to be effective for me. I point this out to illustrate to you how hearing aids may be helpful for some folks and how they may not for others. In this slide, I show you pictures of cochlear implants. So as you can see in the top 2 pictures, the apparatus that goes around the ear looks very similar to a hearing aid. It is then attached by a wire and magnets attached to the implant in the head. And then there's a wire that goes down and is attached to a box that's held on a belt clip on their belt with the mechanics in it. The bottom 2 pictures are pictures of more current cochlear implants that are commonly used today. There's no box that's held on the belt. There's no wires that come all the way down. All of the entire apparatus is up on the head, but it works similarly in that it has the mechanics that are wrapped around the ear. It has the magnet in place that's on the head. Now, I try to be careful anytime I discuss technology, as I've shared with you before. In deaf culture, there are very strong opinions and very strong biasness about technology that's used, and I definitely have that as well. So I hope that I'm able to give you a neutral view of how cochlear implants work. But again, when we look at these with functional considerations, cochlear implants rely on development of brain centers to be able to identify sound, to have an awareness of sound, to comprehend human speech, and are not necessarily always effective for individuals that are born profoundly deaf, or for individuals that may have been deaf for a majority of their lives and then decide to get it once they're older. We find, at least in my experience, that these have not always been effective in those cases. They have been most effective with those individuals who have lost their hearing loss later on in life, who have developed those brain centers, who have developed the ability to be aware, to identify, and to comprehend human speech, and who may already have speech involved in themselves. This is a very difficult topic to discuss as well, because we often see in media these miracle videos where an individual gets a cochlear implant and they turn it on, and this miracle, they're able to hear their children for the first time, or children are able to hear their parents for the first time. And unfortunately, that's not exactly how cochlear implants work. Getting the implant is just the first step. It then requires years and years and years of fine-tuning how the cochlear implant is set up, many years of audiological training, of speech therapy training, of all kinds of different therapies to try to get it to work. For some folks, they do get to a point where they're able to achieve one of those 3 levels of functional success. For some folks, despite all the hard work and fine-tuning and mechanisms and improvements in cochlear implants, they simply don't work. So there again, we see a spectrum when it comes to the success of cochlear implants, depending on individuals, depending on a number of factors. I'd like to spend a few minutes giving you just some tips for directly communicating with somebody who may be hard of hearing, who may be deaf, who may use a cochlear implant, may use a hearing loss, but just some tips as kind of a starting base for facilitating communication. Probably the number one most important thing that I can tell you is to maintain eye contact. Even if you're working with a deaf individual and you're working with an interpreter, and we'll discuss how to work with interpreters a little more in depth in a later session or a later unit, it is vitally important to maintain eye contact with that person. For deaf individuals, it's easier for them to read your facial expressions, and as we learned in our section on American Sign Language, facial expressions are vitally important in American Sign Language and in deaf individuals' communication, as is body language. So maintaining eye contact can help that individual with trying to read both of those. One of the things that has been a great source of entertainment for me over the years, and especially in my work in the mental health field, is enunciation. I have seen it all, I think I can officially say, when it comes to how hearing folks try to enunciate when working with a deaf and hard of hearing person. My tip for you, just enunciate normally. There's no need to yell and shout at the person. They're either going to hear you or they're not. There's no need to try to enunciate like this. That's not going to help facilitate communication at all, and if anything, you're going to look a little strange. Just enunciate, talk, communicate normally. It's important anytime that you may be facilitating groups, you may be on a treatment team and you're working with a group of individuals with a consumer, to take turns. Don't everybody try to speak on top of each other or try to speak at once or try to share the same information. Make sure that you identify who is speaking so that deaf and hard of hearing person is able to look at them, make the eye contact before that person starts speaking. Oftentimes in hearing cultures and hearing interactions, we don't take the time to stop and say, this is Elijah talking. Wait till everybody looks and then communicate. We tend to kind of talk over each other at times. We tend to jump from one person around the room, which is easy for hearing folks because you can tell who's speaking. A little more difficult for deaf and hard of hearing individuals. As we talked about when we talked in the American Sign Language unit, it's important to define the topic of the conversation first. This will help, especially with hard of hearing folks who are maybe trying to read your lips, speech read, lip read, and need to do a little bit of guesswork in there to figure out what you're saying. If they know the topic of the conversation, it's a little easier for them and helps narrow down their guesswork. For deaf individuals, as we talked about again in our first unit on American Sign Language, it's a topic prominent language. That's how deaf individuals communicate. So defining the topic is a cultural norm and will help facilitate communication with them as well. One thing that we see a degree of variance in hearing folks is the use of hands. I'm sure by this point you've noticed that I tend to use my hands a lot when I'm talking. Some of it I'm signing to help me remember the English words that I'm trying to say, and sometimes it's just to force a habit. When I communicate, my hands are flying, and so I do that. Some hearing folks do that as well, and some don't. Feel free when you're working with a deaf or hard of hearing person to gesture freely. Use your hands when you talk. Use gestures to help communicate the information. For a hard of hearing individual, again, that may be supplemental information they can use to fully understand what you're trying to communicate, as it would for a deaf person. Along those same lines, feel free to use facial expressions. Feel free to use more than you may normally body language to, again, help facilitate that communication. It's important anytime you're working with a deaf or hard of hearing person to be careful of the lighting in the room. Make sure that there's plenty of lighting so that individual can see your face, your body, your lips, your mouth very clearly. Make sure there's no glare behind you that may drown out any facial expressions or may drown out a hard of hearing individual who's trying to lip read and will not be able to see your mouth. when we talk about communications as well, I want to make you aware of some technology that's available to help with communications. The first one is relay services. So if you need to call a deaf individual, you can call them through using the relay. In most states, it's 711. Here in Missouri, you can dial 711 as well. That will connect you with a relay operator who will then connect you to the deaf individual. Now, relay services are very effective when you're trying to contact a deaf individual that uses a TTY or a TDD, a telecommunications device for the deaf. It looks like a fancy typewriter. It has a keyboard on it, has two little suction cup looking things on the top that they set the phone in, and they type through a series of beeps that goes through the phone. This is a communication device that deaf individuals have been using for years and years and years. We're starting to see it on the decline now. It's not used very often as we're seeing an emergence of what we call video phones, and I'll explain that in just a minute. But for those individuals that do still use TTYs, the relay service is an optimal way of connecting with them through telephone calls. Now, as I said, we're starting to see a emergence of video phones and technology. There are a variety of different kinds of video phones. There are a variety of companies that provide this video phone service. Deaf and hard of hearing individuals are able to get a video phone for free that is provided through the FCC because it is similar and it is seen as a telephone device. They're provided for free. And deaf individuals are starting to use this more and more often because now instead of relying on an operator, they can directly see the person they're trying to call and can communicate with that person. Along with these video phones, we have what's called VRS, or Video Relay Services. Again, this is a relay system, but this helps facilitate communication between deaf and hearing individuals when the deaf individual has a video phone. They are able to call and dial any phone number they need to. If they want to call and order a pizza, they can punch in the name of their local pizza place. It will automatically connect them to an operator who is a certified and licensed interpreter that will sign to the deaf person and then call the pizza place and speak to them. So whatever the deaf person signs, they will interpret, speak to the hearing person, and then vice versa. When the hearing person speaks, the interpreter will interpret and sign to the deaf person. Again, this helps facilitate communication even better than older systems of TTYs because now deaf folks can communicate directly in American Sign Language and ASL rather than relying on having some form of English literacy and typing in English through the TTYs. Now, VRS, or Video Relay Services, cannot be used when the deaf and hearing individual are in the same location. Again, this is a regulation by the FCC. It's a rule, it's a law that they have to follow. And this can only be used when deaf and hearing people are in separate locations. Another communication tool that we have is called VRI, or Video Remote Interpreting. What this involves, again, is some kind of video system where an interpreter in a remote location can be dialed up and can serve to interpret. Right now, it's not very widely used in mental health settings. It's starting to be more and more used in medical settings. It can at times save money on interpreters. In the interpreting field, general practice is to bill a 2-hour minimum, to bill mileage. And so if you're hiring an interpreter for a 15-minute medication check appointment, you're paying an interpreter 2 hours for those 15 minutes. You're paying the mileage to and from the location, and it can get quite expensive. Using VRI can help save those costs by connecting remotely to that interpreter. It will cut down on your billing, it will cut down on paying the mileage, and it can sometimes be a more effective way of using interpreting. Obviously, in the mental health field, if we're providing therapy, you don't want to have a remote interpreter. You want to have a person who's there working with you. And again, we'll discuss that a little more in our unit on working with interpreters and also in our unit on treatment teams. We're going to spend the remainder of this unit discussing windows of developmental opportunity. That's a term Dr. Pollard used on his online training and we're going to continue it here. We're going to build a hierarchy of these windows of developmental opportunity that starts from birth and goes on to adulthood. Each one of these stages in psychological development of an individual that is hard of hearing or deaf builds upon each other and has significant impacts on one another. So we're going to start first with just the hearing loss, just the medical condition of not being able to hear or being hard of hearing, and the impact that that's automatically going to have on somebody's life. Beyond any other stages of a development, not being able to hear is going to impact everything. The next stage we look at is a parent and child relationships and the quality of these relationships. How does a parent react when they find out that their child is deaf or they find out that their child has hearing loss? Oftentimes we see that there is a cycle of grief that accompanies the news that your child is deaf or hard of hearing, similar to the cycle of grief when we lose somebody. There's anger, there's guilt, there's shame. Sometimes we see parents react on one end of the spectrum with enmeshment. When I was working as a therapist here in Kansas City, I had a deaf child, who was actually a 40-year-old woman, and her elderly mother come in to see me for family therapy. The mother's goal of the therapy was to get the child to be independent to where they could move out on their own because the mother was sick, was not doing well. And for the 40 years of this woman's life, mom did everything for her. Cooked, cleaned, laundry, drove her to and from appointments, handled all her medical issues, handled everything. And unfortunately, we see that as very common reaction of hearing parents with deaf children. If you remember the statistic I shared with you, it's over 90% of deaf individuals being born into hearing families, and those hearing families reacting by becoming enmeshed, by trying to do everything, feeling bad for that deaf child, and doing everything they can for them. On the other end of the spectrum, we also see families that reject the deaf child, think that there's something wrong with him, and therefore they reject him. They want nothing to do with him. They're kind of cast aside. They're seen as the outsiders in the family. And I know that especially to mental health professionals, may sound a little strange that parent could do that with their children, but it happens, and we do see it. With each one of these windows of developmental opportunity we're going to discuss here, there is a full spectrum of responses, from healthy to unhealthy, and how a parent chooses to respond, how a deaf or hard of hearing individual chooses to respond along that spectrum will have a grave impact on their lives. Does that parent treat that child normally? How does the parent seek support for their deaf or hard of hearing child? Is going to impact that relationship that they have. How does that parent react to that child as far as curiosity and exploration? This is tough for any parent who has a young child. When that child wants to go off and explore the world, when they get curious, when they want to see what happens when they walk up the stairs for the first time, or crawl up the stairs, or try to crawl up the kitchen cabinets to get cups. It can be anxiety producing for any parent. How does the parent of a deaf or hard of hearing child react to that? Do they allow them to explore and to express curiosity normally, or do they overprotect, over-shelter that child to compensate for their deafness? Or again, on perhaps the more unhealthy side of the spectrum of reactions, do they allow that child to just do whatever they want and don't protect them or don't guide them in their curiosity and exploration? The next window of developmental opportunity revolves around language and communication. This has a huge impact in how that child may view the world. The choices a family makes for the deaf child, as far as, are they going to teach them American Sign Language? Is the family themselves going to learn American Sign Language? Are they going to choose another manually coded English type of language? Are they going to choose oralism? Are they going to choose any number of systems out there for communication and language with deaf and hard of hearing individuals? In our previous unit on deaf culture, we talked about the importance of social programs. So the next step or next window of developmental opportunity revolves around school programs and socialization. What method of education do they choose for their child? Do they send them to the state deaf school? We see a lot of times deaf children being sent at very young ages to go to a residential state-run deaf school in which they're separated from their families from a young age, when they have to learn socialization skills in a dormitory type environment. Does the family decide to put that child into a mainstream setting where they're attending a hearing school and may not have any socialization with peers? They may be ostracized because of their hearing loss from their hearing peers in public schools. These can all have a huge impact on that child's development, as well as their ability to have healthy, productive relationships with others. We've talked a little bit about fund of information, and we will continue to talk about fund of information and fund of information gaps throughout this video series. But the fund of information that child is able to obtain is going to be impacted by all of the previous windows of development. Are they able to achieve a level of literacy where they can read brochures and read literature and learn from those readings? Obviously, they're going to miss out from environmental noises, but do they have family in their lives that take the time to educate them on things that they may miss out? Do they have school teachers or peers or older peers that will take the time to educate them and provide them with a fund of information? The next stage of developmental opportunities we're going to discuss is adolescence. As mental health professionals, I'm sure you're aware that that is a stage in any person's life where they are developing their self-identity. They're asking the questions, who am I? A lot of that comes from their peers. A lot of that development comes from their family. So all of the previous windows, how the family interacts with that child, what educational or socialization systems they choose to put that child in, is going to have a huge impact on how they develop that identity. The next stage is social cognition. This stage is particularly important for later stages in development. This involves observing others and mimicking those behaviors. How does that deaf and hard of hearing person treated by their peers, by their family, by adults they interact with, and thusly, what types of behaviors do they then take from that and mimic? Academic achievements, I think, is fairly self-explanatory. How well that child does in school is going to depend on the parent-child relationships, going to depend on the level of curiosity and exploration that was fostered in their family, what kind of language and communication they were provided with, what kind of younger school programs and socialization they were involved with, what kind of attention was paid to their fund of information, will all affect what kind of academic achievement they receive, will affect how far they go in their academics. One story to share with you about this is my brother Noah, who I spoke about in previous sessions. When he was in elementary school, he was attending a deaf school, and teachers, of course, as teachers do, had a conversation with the children about what they wanted to be when they grow up. Noah has always said that he wanted to be a preacher. That has been in his blood, and it's just something that he wants to do. And when he expressed this to this teacher, the teacher's response was, "But you're deaf. You can't be a preacher. It would be better for you to learn how to be a mechanic. Then you don't have to interact with others. You can just work on cars and fix cars and work with your hands and be done with it." Now, Noah, fortunately, came from a family that had strong parent-child relationships, that curiosity and exploration was explored, language and communication was provided, good school programs and socialization was attended to, fund of information, all of these windows of development that we've talked about. And so he knew better than to think that he couldn't achieve and chase after his dreams. But what about for those deaf and hard of hearing individuals who aren't provided those opportunities along their development, and then are told by their teachers, are told by other adults that they can't chase their dreams, they can't become what they want, they can't go to college and learn and achieve all their goals because they're deaf? That's going to have significant impact on their lives, period. What kind of adaptive behaviors does that child have? Again, if they've not been provided with healthy responses, with healthy opportunities in their development, how well are they going to be able to adapt to things that come up in life? And we all know that things come up in life. The next stage revolves around esteem, self-esteem, how that person views themselves and their place with others. We see all too often with deaf or hard of hearing individuals that they view, because of their previous experiences with these stages of development, that hearing individuals are better than them, that hearing individuals have more opportunities, they know more, they're smarter, we should just do what they say. And what impact do you think that may have on self-esteem, on how they view themselves and how they view their relationships with others, how they view their relationships with hearing individuals? What level of independence has that deaf or hard of hearing person able to achieve based on all the other steps? And then our final stage of development kind of comes full circle here, is how well is that deaf or hard of hearing individual then able to be a parent to their children? I point this out specifically because we see this frequently, and unfortunately, that deaf adults that have children don't know what to do with them because of fund of information gaps, because of a unhealthy parent-child relationship. They've never been able to learn how to take care of their own child. So how does that impact it? All too often we see children being taken from deaf parents, not from a lack of trying, not from a lack of love, not from a lack of attention, but from a lack of that deaf individual just not knowing how to care for their child, never being taught, never being shown how to obtain the information that they might need. This is the end of our Unit 3. I appreciate you watching this video. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions or comments, here is my contact information again. Feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.